Welcome to the Corporate Director Podcast, where we discuss the experiences and ideas behind what's working in corporate board governance in our digital tech-fueled world. Here, you'll discover new insights from corporate leaders and governance researchers with compelling stories about corporate governance, strategy, board culture, risk management, digital transformation, and more.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Corporate Director Podcast, the voice of modern governance. My name is Dottie Schindlinger, Executive Director of the Diligent Institute, and I'm joined once again by my fantabulous co-host, Megan Day. Megan, how are you doing today?
Hey, Dottie. You know what? I'm okay. 2025 is certainly off to an interesting start. I spent the first 10 days of the year in Southern California and left the day that the fires started. And wow, it's been a heavy start to this year.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, there really kind of can't be anything more horrific than seeing scenes of just such devastation and so many people suffering. And so, you know, we have so many colleagues that live and work in that area, so many customers based in that area. It's just really awful. We have family actually that live right near UCLA campus, and you know, they've got 2 young children. They've been spending the last week in a hotel just trying to get away from the smoke, because even though the fires largely have been doused, there's still just such smoke and bad air quality everywhere, and it's just been really rough. And they know a lot of people that have been affected. So hopefully our wallets are open to help people out there. They need everything. They've lost everything. It's been a really intense start to the year. And speaking of which, I mean, Megan, you know, the new administration is in office now. Any predictions for what we're going to see in these first couple of weeks of the new administration?
I mean, no predictions. I'm certainly not in any place to make them. But what has been top of mind for me, even with the fires, is just how, you know, you think about the administration, like the mercurialness of it and him, our very fearless leader. I don't know that I can call him that. But I think about the fires, too, and the speed, the unexpectedness and the speed at which it just transformed and upended lives instantly. And how do we start to think about the world that we live in that way, where everything can change on a dime? And as business leaders, like, what do we need to prepare for that? It's not just around seeing around corners. It is just taking risk management to a whole nother level.
I think that's a really good point, Megan. And actually, it's a good tie-in to the interview that we have for today, which was with Tim Youngblood, who's a former CISO for a bunch of big companies, including, you know, McDonald's, T-Mobile, Dell, Kimberly-Clark. He's in the CISO Hall of Fame, which honestly was something I'd never heard of before I learned that about him. But, you know, having a conversation with him about cybersecurity. I mean, cybersecurity, cyber events are very similar to natural disasters in that way, because they can come out of nowhere. You can feel fully protected and ready to go, and then just be like absolutely humbled in a matter of moments. And like a devastating fire, you know, the average time to recover, like the average cycle time for recovering from a cyber incident, it's like 258 days. It's like nearly a year. It's most of a year to recover from an incident. And the cost of each incident is going way, 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 way up. So actually, you know, it is interesting. We're talking about the new administration. You and I never got a chance to recap on the breathtaking number of executive orders that the Biden administration put out in their final days in office, including one around cybersecurity that I thought was really interesting. I mean, it provided, I thought, a pretty comprehensive view of the Biden administration's assessment of cyber readiness for the federal government and what do we need to do to protect the country's infrastructure, federal agencies. And there was a lot there. And one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting was the pronouncement that there's a desire to use more AI tools to fight cyber. And that is sort of a new frontier in the fight against cyber criminals. And you'll hear it in the interview with Tim. We've got some optimism now around cyber, because maybe in the next few years, we will find ourselves ahead of the criminals for the first time ever since cybersecurity became a thing. That's kind of exhilarating, actually. I mean, we've never been able to say such a thing. And isn't that interesting? I think we've been focusing so much attention on the cyber risk of AI rather than AI's ability to fight cyber risk. So kind of interesting. I'd love to hear your take on the executive order and any part of that.
For sure. You know, the executive order, I think, is certainly important. And I think just in light of the 2024 and the 2023 that we all had with the number of breaches and major incidents, the idea that somebody could take down our infrastructure in the United States very quickly and unexpectedly, I feel it's really tangible, I think, for a lot of people. And as I think it said in one of the comments around the executive order, cybersecurity is really bipartisan. This is about protecting this country. And I think every American agrees that that's something that we would like to do, I would hope. And so I think it's really important for that thread to continue. I think, even when we think about some of the regulatory changes that might happen with the new administration, people have said, oh, well, will the cyber disclosures, will that change with this administration? Are they going to claw back what was rolled out in 2023? And I don't know. I don't see that necessarily happening. And from what I've read, it seems like probably the least likely to see that occur, because I think everyone does really understand, maybe more than ever before, the risks ahead of us here.
Yeah, and it's interesting, I agree with you. Not only is it a nonpartisan issue, it cuts across every sector. It cuts across every industry. It doesn't matter whether your organization is a public or private company, a nonprofit organization, a government agency, a public school. Every single entity has to think about cybersecurity. I mean, really, truly. And yet, the general public is just so over it. The latest surveys show that people just are kind of numb to cyber incidents these days. Like when there's a big attack and, there's a bunch of breached records and they get breach notification, they just kind of throw it in the trash because it's like the fifth they received that week. It's a sad state of affairs. But listen, let's listen to the interview with Tim Youngblood. He gives us some reasons to be a little bit more optimistic. And I think you and I are all doom and gloom when it comes to this topic. So let's listen to Tim and then we can go back and talk a little bit further.
Perfect.
Joining us on the Corporate Director podcast today is Tim Youngblood, a former Chief Information Security Officer for 4 major brands, including Dell, Kimberly-Clark, McDonald's, and T-Mobile. He's a member of the CISO Hall of Fame. Tim now serves as an angel investor for several cybersecurity, clean technology, media, and consumer product goods companies. He's also currently the CISO in residence at Astrix Security. Tim, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
Well, Tim, you've had an incredible career. In fact, I don't think I've ever heard of the CISO Hall of Fame. That's incredibly cool. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you got into this role? How did you get interested in cybersecurity in the first place? And tell us a little more about your career.
Yeah, it's an interesting journey. I grew up on the East Coast in Atlanta, and grew up as an only child, so I had a lot of time on my hands. And one of the interests that got my attention were computers. And I had a friend that had one, and next thing I know was at their house every afternoon. And so I became kind of a self-taught hacker. I went on and got my degree in computer information systems, then eventually got a master's degree in entrepreneurship. Here recently I completed a program with MIT, centered around product engineering, product design. So those have been kind of center points throughout my career. I started out as a programmer, a network architect, been a certified project manager, an auditor, a director, and finally I became a CISO at one point. So, and as you said, I've been a CISO for 4 major brands, was the very first CISO for Dell, was the very first CISO for Kimberly-Clark Corporation as well. So created those roles there. And, those were some of the things why I got inducted into the Hall of Fame. So I was one of the first inductees into the Hall of Fame when the industry started that process.
Tim, I know that our listeners are only hearing audio, but as I look at you, it's really striking me how recent cybersecurity is. I think about it as, you're still relatively young in your career, and here you've been the first CISO at Dell, which is a major technology company. So it is kind of fascinating. I will say our listeners are mostly corporate directors, and we know from the surveys and the research that we do that cybersecurity is a major issue for them. So I want to start by picking your brain about 2024. It was a really kind of tumultuous year on the cyber front. So what were some of the things that stood out to you from all the cyber events of the last year that senior leadership teams and board members should really be paying special attention to?
Yeah, definitely. 2024 was a record-breaking year, I think, in the area of breaches. You think about some of the bigger ones, AT&T, there's breach with Snowflake, Ticketmaster. I mean, these are all impactful events. And then you also think about this kind of the crippling effect of global outages that we saw with products like CrowdStrike. The thing that as a board member, which, now I've kind of elevated myself to being on boards as well. So it was definitely important for me as the company that I work with on boards to make sure they're aware of these things and realize how complicated cybersecurity is. And there just is no silver bullets. There's no one audit. There's no one product that is going to solve all cyber issues. And it's just a continuous sort of assessment of determining what's the biggest risk for the company and then what can we do to address it. And it's not a matter of if it's going to happen or when it's going to happen. That's the way we used to kind of look at that. It's not if, it's when. It's not even that. It's now. It's happening right now. Right. And it's up to enterprises to figure out where the now is and to be active doing that because it's already happened. You're already breached right now. It's just how long is it going to take for you to discover it and how much damage is going to happen in between that time. And every company has to understand its cyber resiliency, because of that. Right. And when you're impacted, what must you do to keep operations going? And what have you done to ensure that's going to happen regardless of what the impact could be?
I also want to talk a little bit about the forecast for 2025, right? Because I think there's a lot happening, especially with generative AI and quantum computing that all have an implication on cybersecurity and cyber threats. Are there significant threats that you're keeping an eye on that you think directors and C-suite should pay attention to?
Yeah, I think 2025 is going to be a little bit more like 2024. You're going to see a lot more issues in supply chain. There's going to be a heavier impact on cloud as, most companies now are at least 80 or 90% in the cloud. And then identity, I think, is a big area that companies are going to have to worry about because identity is basically the new perimeter, right? So no longer are we all behind these firewalls that protect us. This is happening everywhere. And generally it's determined on who you are and what you have access to. And if you're compromised, what does that mean to the company? To address some of these companies, you're going to have to understand, what their provider diversity is, right? And do they have layered security? It's this concept that has been around a long time and is still relevant today is security in depth. You're going to have a failure somewhere. So what's the next countermeasure that's going to catch the issue that you're going to have? And I think that's going to become more important in 2025. And companies have to limit their impact too. So they have to start leveraging things like micro-segmentation, understand that parts of their network are going to be compromised, but how do you, again, limit that exposure?
Can you say a bit more about microsegmentation? I'm interested in that because I do think that is something companies don't necessarily do particularly well. Can you say a little bit more about some good practices there, some good strategies there?
Yeah, microsegmentation is not an easy task, right? I've gone through that with several companies, segmentation in general, because it requires you to understand all of your data flows and how data is, transversing throughout your environment. It can take quarters, years to do it effectively. And it's something that, you got to start now. And it takes understanding, how your processes align to your technology. It's not, again, like one tool that's going to get you there. It's going to take multiple kind of assessment areas that are going to define what your environment's like and then tell you where you can compartmentalize that environment. And there's a concept at cyber that's been around for 15 years, but is now a reality. It's called zero trust. And I think you're going to see a lot of companies focusing on that.
That's really, really good to hear. I think zero trust is a little bit better of an approach. So let's talk a bit more about how companies can be more proactive versus reactive. I always sort of think of a lot of companies' approach to cybersecurity as very reactive, especially at the leadership level, right? Board members and C-suites tend not to hear about something until it's already a burning fire. So how can organizations do a better job of being more proactive in this space?
Yeah, I think it comes first with understanding, what's the risk appetite? And that's unfortunately not a discussion that happens in a lot of boardrooms. And unfortunately, even in management teams, they don't really focus in on what is our risk appetite. What are we willing to allow and what must never happen? And I think it takes some frank discussions on aligning on what that is. And then understanding what assets support the worst case scenarios for you. And then, what are you doing to kind of build that resiliency around those assets and those systems? It's really interesting. I think most companies nowadays are digital to some degree, and they're literally one click away from an extinction event. And I don't think enough companies are taking a step back to think about, okay, to be proactive at this, I need to understand where my biggest risk points are, what's going to actually bring the company down, what's going to stop business. And then, how do I ensure I put every possible capability to prevent that?
So, Tim, I have a follow up question there because, as I speak with you, it's very clear to me you've got a business mentality. I mean, you're sort of looking at the whole enterprise. You're not just looking at it through the lens of cybersecurity. But my guess would be that a lot of directors and C suites sort of look at their CISO and think this person doesn't always speak my language. They don't always speak in terms of enterprise risk or in terms of our business model or where our assets really lie. Do you have any guidance to CISOs or to even leadership teams to give to CISOs that can help them do a better job of translating the risk into terms that boards and C-suites can actually do something about?
It's a difficult arena for a lot of technology leaders in general. And I mentor about 10 CISOs right now. One of the things that, I highly suggest to them is to make sure you understand how your company makes money. What are those big levers that, that drive the capability of the company? And then how do you align to that? And then how do you speak to senior leaders about how you support that? Or do you understand what the big strategic pillars are for that company? And then what capability are you, deploying or supporting to make those things happen? And those are the things you need to bring into the boardroom and get them to understand that aspect because, the board ultimately is concerned with strategy, talent, and risk. And you have to be able to line all three of those.
That's great, great advice. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk more about AI, everybody's favorite topic right now, generative AI. So let's talk a little bit about, sort of your perspective on how AI is transforming both cybersecurity defenses and cyber attacks. What are some of the things that you're seeing?
Yeah, AI, of course, is the biggest buzzword and reality I think we have today. And what we've seen, I think, over this last 2 years is more what I would call assisted technology. I mean, you see a lot of co-pilots, human assisted sort of solutions that, allow you to get things done quicker. And there's been some risks associated with, that happening. You're starting to see a little bit of a transition into something that's a higher capability of automation, I think. And it'll be interesting to see how the evolution of things like AI agents, allow systems to be in the cyber realm self-defending and without any human intervention. I was in a session with a professor at MIT, earlier this week, and they're talking about this concept of AGI, which is artificial general intelligence. And that's just allowing AI to work on its own. And, when we start to see this hit mainstream, it's really going to be a game changer in the dynamics of defenders versus attackers. And, I think for the first time, you'll see defenders with the advantage, which, up until this point, it's all been about the attacker. And then the attackers will need to catch up with where the defenders are, which will be very interesting to see when we get to that point. But it starts with this whole AGI and AI agents and allowing them to work on their own and then trusting that they're going to do the right thing at the right time.
As long as we don't end up going down the road of the Terminator, I'm all for it.
Yes, yes. It will be interesting when we get to machines telling us what to do. Right?
As long as we're not talking about Skynet, everything's fine. Well, so let's talk a little bit about the regulatory space too, because I know this is an area that a lot of leaders are paying attention to. We've got a new political administration coming into office. There's a lot of talk about what might change. We had the new rules put forth from the SEC last year around cybersecurity disclosures. So what are some of the possible cyber-related regulatory shifts that companies might kind of anticipate in 2025? What are you tracking?
Yeah, I'm paying close attention particularly as new administration comes in and their policies around things like H-1B1 visas and how that could impact all of tech. And it'll just be interesting to see how, digital supply chains withstand some of the changes that may happen in that space and, how that might impact innovation, for the industry. And so I think a lot of leaders are assessing that because they know that there's some leverage on that type of process to bring talent in to address problems. And, if that's limited in some way, then, what are they going to do next, right? On the more traditional regulatory route, I know PCI is evolving to its next iteration, and there's going to be a heavier focus in PCI on identity, particularly in the arena of non-human identities. And so that's going to be something that's going to be brand new for a lot of companies to start to focus on again, that will change sort of the security stack, I think, than they've had in the past. And then just kind of increasing regulatory guidance on AI and then the ethics of AI will be interesting, and not too different than data ethics. And just a question of, just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should do it. And we've seen plenty of examples of that throughout the years.
Those are some really great topics to keep an eye on. I'd love to actually maybe just ask you a quick follow-up question on the H-1B1 visa issue, because I mean, you've been a CISO at major brands, I'm sure run large teams at each one of those brands. In your experience, what percentage of your workforce is coming in through a visa program?
Yeah, it changed. I think in cyber, it's probably a little bit more limited in tech overall. It's not uncommon for teams to have 10% of the workforce coming through that type of avenue, and particularly those that are heavy development organizations. And so that's going to be a challenge again if they start to get limited and they can't get that same talent back in the country or working on projects and assignments that are important to the development of their companies.
That's great for us to keep an eye on. Well, last question I want to ask you before we shift gears again is about future proofing. Because we're talking about 2025, but obviously things are going to evolve quickly. And so what are some things that boards and senior leadership teams might be able to do this year to kind of help future proof their organization's approach to cyber risk management for the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot more focus on subcommittees that are specific to cyber and technology as a whole. For the last few decades, those topics have been sort of integrated into audit committee, or they may be part of the full board and one topic once a year or once a quarter. And I think there's going to have to be some establishment board oversight over some of the greatest assets in companies have today, and that's data management and governance, right? And those things that are driving digital transformations today, or have driven digital transformations. So I think the board is going to have a lot more oversight into what's happening there. And then, I think it's going to require a lot more tech savvy people to be on boards, and those tech savvy people who are strategic enough to understand that it's not all about the technology, but how the technology drives the business. But you're going to need to bring on more people who understand cybersecurity and know what questions to ask management, down on a detail that can get, the whole board comfortable that the company's doing the right thing.
So, Tim, before we let you go, there are 3 questions that we like to ask all of our guests that join us on the show. So the first question is, what is the biggest difference between boardrooms today and 10 years from now?
Yeah, the most obvious thing is, I think you'll see more technology professionals in senior board positions. I think that has to happen, particularly as we get into more companies being driven by, AI technology, and all companies basically becoming tech companies. And then AI will be making more decisions, and boards will have to come up with a framework to assess the guardrails and how you assign accountability to when those decisions happen. And so that's going to be new for boards. And I think boards will have to master the crisis and how to navigate disruptions on a scale that the industry's never seen before. Because again, as you do become a technology company, you're one click away from disaster now, right? So those crises are going to come, and, most boards aren't prepared for that. They haven't really gone through, what their role is when the company goes into a crisis mode. And I think that's something that's going to be more important to boards in the future.
Do you think we'll see AI board members?
You know what? You absolutely will see something like that. I have no doubt. And it was interesting, as I was saying, I was in a session with MIT this week, and they actually shared with me there's a team member you can actually hire that is an AI software engineer. It's called Devin. And Devin can be a team member for you. You can hire Devin by the month or by the quarter, and they're basically a person on the team that does work. And I think, why not? You'll see board members that are like that too, that have a lot of knowledge and know maybe questions asked that most board members don't know how to ask.
Tim, does this mean that we're both out of a job and we can just go kick back on an island somewhere now?
I don't know. Well, regardless, you always have to have somebody watching, the AI, right? So there's got to be a person
Right.
somewhere around there.
I love it. Well, the next question we like to ask is, what's the last thing that you read or watched or listened to that made you think about governance in a new light?
Yeah, so I'm a member of the National Association of Corporate Directors, NACD, and the NACD actually releases several what they call blue commission reports, and there's one on technology. It's called Technology Leadership in the Boardroom, and it's full of just amazing insights on how to best position boards for like future technology decisions. And I highly recommend, all board members go and download that report, and it will give you all the nuggets you need to kind of get started to think about how you need to change your boardroom because of technology.
That's a great recommendation. And finally, Tim, what's your current passion project?
Yeah, so as we talked about, I'm an angel investor, and so I hear a lot of people's dreams all the time. One of the companies that I'm an investor and also an advisory board member of is a media company called Tiny Hawk Productions, and I love how they are giving a voice to the underrepresented and telling stories that need to be told. I'm just proud to be part of that. A great example for them is they developed a series that's called Herd. That's getting a lot of traction now, and it's about the very first Black female Michelin chef and her story of cooking for her family to being on a top-rated chef show and getting noticed to finally struggling to open up her first restaurant. And it is an incredible story, and I just love being part of projects like that.
I love that. Well, Tim, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
It was my pleasure. I enjoyed the conversation. Anytime you need to chat, just ring me up.
We've been joined today by Tim Youngblood, former CISO of Dell, Kimberly-Clark, McDonald's, and T-Mobile, who now serves as the CISO in residence at Astrix Security. Tim, thank you so much for being our guest.
Thank you.
Well, Dottie, that was a great interview. I think I'm in the Tim fangirl club now. Great perspective. Although I will say, thinking back to our earlier commentary, the idea of companies being one click away from extinction, I still think needs to be on everybody's mind. Okay, we said we weren't going to be all doom and gloom. It's hard. It's hard when you're talking about cyber risk. No, really, truly. I thought it was kind of interesting, too, to talk to him about some of the potential regulatory shifts that companies might want to pay attention to. And he's right about the visa program, because one of the other sort of startling statistics is the incredible dearth of talent that we have to put into cybersecurity jobs in the U.S. I mean, I think right now something like 26% of cybersecurity jobs just chronically go unfilled. I mean, that is just really, really awful. And by the way, some of those jobs are the top job, because the CISO role now has so much more liability and so much more scrutiny that it can be really hard to retain amazing CISOs. In fact, Tim is a good example, right? He was a CISO at all these major brands, and he's now not a CISO. He's a consultant to CISOs. He's probably about the 7th CISO I know who has taken that road for this reason, because, he wants to do the work. He wants to help people do the work. He wants to stay in the fight against cybercrime, but he doesn't want the personal liability to go along with it. And that should be a signal to a lot of directors and C-suite leaders that we need to do a better job of ensuring that our CISOs have all the protection they need. Treat them like your CFO. Think about them. Think about, what do you do if there's a major, case of fraud that the CFO doesn't know about? You don't want the CFO to go down with the ship, right? You want that person there in the fight, shoring up things, making sure everything's good. You want that same thing for the CISO. And by the way, I'm not saying that we should absolve CISOs that do bad things. What I am saying is we should protect the ones who are good, because it's going to get harder and harder to find that talent. And talent like Tim is really hard to come by. I mean, here's somebody who not only is a consummate expert in this field, but also has just got a really good business brain and can translate these concepts into things that matter to directors and C-suite leaders. And so, okay, I'm off my soapbox, Megan. Take the mic. Shut mine down. No, it's very funny, Dottie, because one of my first takeaways from that conversation was, wow, how lucky are these organizations to have had someone like Tim at the helm for a long time. It just really comes through in the wisdom that he shares. I think for me, though, it again comes back to not necessarily this idea of like demystifying cybersecurity. And yes, of course, you need to make sure that your leaders are speaking, in the same language as the board of directors. But I still keep thinking that like the board needs to be smart on this, but they don't need to be experts. And if they just continue to think about this as any other incredibly critical risk to their business, they're going to find themselves in a better position than if they didn't.
Well, to your point, Megan, he gave us a very practical list of things that the board could put on its agenda. For example, have a conversation about your organization's cyber risk appetite. That's a perfect conversation for the board to have. Have it at the audit committee level, or if you've got a cyber risk committee or a risk and safety committee, or even at the full board level, have a conversation. What is this organization's appetite for risk? So do we need to spend more money to reduce our level of risk? Do we need to offload some risk? Are we okay accepting some risk? What are the worst case scenarios? And really think about, if something was attacked, like we all sort of focus on protecting wells of data, right? Like, how do we make sure that this data is protected? But that's not the only way that business can be disrupted by a cyber attack. So really be creative. There's thousands of examples that you can draw from. Do a tabletop exercise. That's another really good thing that you can do. And then the other thing that I thought he gave that was such practical advice was give some guidance to your CISOs about how your company makes money. Often they don't ask that question. And when they don't understand that answer, or they don't know to ask that question, they can be giving you lots of information about things that actually really aren't that significant and miss things that are so significant. So I thought those three things were just really practical tips that every board could implement tomorrow if they haven't already done so. And thanks, Tim. I think that was really great.
Well, we'll hear more from Tim, I believe, at Diligent's virtual cybersecurity summit in a couple of weeks.
Yes, February 5th and 6th is the virtual cyber risk summit. If you haven't signed up, you should. It's free. There's literally nothing standing in your way. Just jump on diligent.com. You'll find information about it under the resources section, and you can sign up. Definitely ask your cybersecurity folks to sign up. Ask your risk executives to sign up. Anybody in your organization that touches cyber, your legal team, your C-suite, your board, you should come to at least a session. It's going to be a great, great event. You'll get a lot of value out of coming. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Corporate Director Podcast, the voice of modern governance. I'm Dottie Schindlinger, and I've been joined by my co-host, Megan Day. I'd like to say a few special thank yous, first and foremost, to our cyber risk guru, Tim Youngblood, podcast producers, Kira Ciccarelli and Steve Clayton, our sponsors, PwC, KPMG, Wilson Sonsini, and Meridian Compensation Partners, and most especially Diligent for letting us do this show. If you like our show, please be sure to give us a rating on your podcast player of choice, and you can also listen to our episodes and check out more from Diligent Institute by going to diligent.com/resources. Thank you so much for listening.
You've been listening to the Corporate Director Podcast. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you'd like to learn more about corporate governance and tools to help directors do their job better, visit www.diligent.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.